Okay, hello everyone. Jim Garrettson here in Bridgewater, Maine. Just coming up from the cellar. We've got a wholesale order with the truck coming tomorrow morning, so we're pushing to try to make it so we're not going to work too awful late tonight. So folks are now trickling in, I see. So welcome. This is Wood Prairie Potato School webinar number 4, and the title of this webinar is, of course, before you harvest, you've got to plant. If you'll remember, those of you that were with us at the last webinar, we talked about harvest. So that's the rationale here is before you can harvest those spuds, you've got to be able to plant them. So we're going to stall for a minute or two while people come on. Our friend Teresa Kelly in Central Maine, she's saying she's getting an error message, so she's going to switch browsers. I guess that goes over my head, so anything you can advise to her, Frank?
No, I'm not sure what the error is, so
okay.
We'll wait and see how she does. Maybe ask people if they can hear you all right.
Okay. Maybe this would be a good chance. Would you use the chat function to let us know if we're coming in loud and clear? We do have a fairly new microphone that we had last time around, but it should be a better audio quality than the first couple of webinars that we did. Thank you, Scott. Scott Wilson is saying we're coming in loud and clear. Arthur, thank you. Sounding good. Okay, good.
It is recording. So.
Okay. Well, we'll let people straggle in, and let's get going. Here's our map for this webinar. I like maps, and this one I believe was from 1920. I think it's a USDA map, and it gives, what would you call that, gradations of the spring planting, the earliest potato planting time. So seeing up in Maine, what is that kind of small font? Is that May 11 there?
Yes.
Where we are, okay, May 11. Well, that's fair. That's the way weather used to be. That used to be when you could plant early potatoes up here. Our friend Barry Campbell in Littleton prides himself on always getting some potatoes planted in April, and he is probably, just guessing, he's probably planted about 50 crops of potatoes, and I think he's probably only missed 4 or 5 of those 50 years of getting potatoes planted in April, and I would guess that almost all of those misses have been in the last 10 years. We are getting wetter, colder springs. There was one year a few years ago when we got our April weather in March, and then we got our March weather in April, but we did lose our snow early, and fellows were planting earlier than I've ever seen, especially late season varieties like Russet Burbanks planting the first week in May. That doesn't happen very often. Okay, so now the interesting thing I would point out here, you see that the East is relatively logical and organized, and it's not that Easterners have more precision in their thought. The factor in that West to where you see this radical departure from the pattern is due to elevation. And I've already forgot what the figure is, but it's something like for every 1,000-foot elevation gain, it's equivalent to, I can't remember, it's either 200 or, it must be 200 or 300 miles further south. So if you're in, say, Colorado, at 9,000 foot elevation, comparing that at the same latitude to, what would that be, about Philadelphia, it would, if you're at 9,000 feet, that would be the equivalent of being approximately something like 1,800, 2,500 miles north. So that's why in the West it is much more difficult to create a map because you've got so much variation of elevation. In the East, there are minor variations, but for the most part, it amounts to the further north you go, the later the spring planting, but it does proceed northward. So if you would like to let us know where you're listening from, you can use the chat function. And also feel free to use that chat function for any questions or comments that you have. Feel free to ask them at any time. We're happy to break stride and answer any questions. Scott's telling us he's calling from Colorado. Hope things are well out in Colorado. Hope you're getting a good snowpack. We have friends that have organic farms on the east side of the Rockies, and they count on that snowpack in the Rockies to get them community irrigation water in the summertime. So I know how important it is in the West to have normalcy of weather. Teresa is down in, Cumberland County. I guess I call that southern Maine, not central Maine. And Rich Streeter is in Buxton, Maine. I'm not exactly sure where Buxton is. I would think it's over by New Hampshire, isn't it? It must be that far down. A little bit of an Aroostook County perspective, I'm afraid. So, okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so, and I promise that the next section is actually going to be connected to potatoes, but it's going to take a little while to get there. Back in January, as some of you may have read in our Seed Piece newsletter, we had the second Agrarian Elders Gathering held in Big Sur, California, and it was a week-long event, and it was a follow-up to the Agrarian Elders Gathering held precisely 2 years before. Now, what was different about this gathering, let me explain. Let me back up maybe and explain what this is all about. Two leading organic farmers, Elliot Coleman here in Maine, who, if you look in this photograph, he's in the blue shirt, kneeling in the second row, and that's my friend Tom Willie in Madera, California, with his arm around Elliot. So that's Elliot Coleman. And then on the second to the back row, towards the right, a fella in a brown plaid shirt with kind of curly dark hair. That's Michael Abelman in British Columbia. So Elliot and Michael conceived of this idea 5 or 6 years ago to bring together organic farmers that for the first time in history had 30, 40, 50 years worth of practical on-farm experience growing organically. And the idea was it would be of value to bring these old-timers together to be able to discuss issues that were confronting organic agriculture. And so that was the first Agrarian Elders Gathering. The location was the Esalen Institute in the town of Big Sur, right on the California coast. Big Sur is the central coast. It's south of Monterey by almost an hour, north of Los Angeles by, I really don't know how much. It must be 4 hours north of Los Angeles, 5 hours. It really is pretty isolated, and I'll explain one manifestation of that isolation coming up. So 2 years ago, we had 24 elders stretched from Maine to California up to British Columbia. In fact, beyond Maine, we had a couple of Canadians from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. What the thought was that at the second Agrarian Elders Gathering, we thought there needed to be a kind of a passing of the torch. So the idea was to bring in half of the Agrarian Elders this January and match them with leaders from the next generation of organic farmers, a dozen of which were chosen and brought in. So you're going to see in that photograph, quite a split. You've got us older ones with gray hair and gray beards, and you've got younger ones, which is quite a generational difference. So those are what are being called youngers. We had one facilitator, and that would be on the very back row. Standing next to me is Woody Tesh from Slow Money in Colorado. He was the facilitator. And then over in that same back row, second from the left, the tallest guy there, that's Dave Murphy from Food Democracy Now! And he was there as an observer, in which for most of the sessions he was able to observe the discussions going on. So the concept behind this meeting was to try to discuss, again, issues of importance to the organic community, and bring in a younger perspective and try to have kind of a cross-pollination, a cultural exchange between generations. The plan is for 2 years from now, the other group of elders that did not meet this year, they'll be meeting at the same location, the Murphy House at Esalen, and there will be another group of youngers, a dozen youngers selected from the leadership of the current young generation of organic farmers, and they'll do more or less what we did this time around. And then 4 years from now, both of the group of dozen youngers will come together, and I guess us old folks are going to go out to pasture. So the youngers will come together 4 years from now, and that will carry on with the agrarian elders will be the next generation. So hopefully we will have handed off some of the knowledge that we've gained from on-the-ground experience. And I should mention, I might have mentioned this in a past webinar, I can't recall, but at the first Agrarian Elders Gathering, filmmaker Deborah Coons Garcia was there with a film crew. She had 2 cameras going at all times and a sound man. And we had 35 hours worth of discussions, which were recorded times 2. And she is in the process of making films about this. She's actually held up a little bit for, she needs funding to help with the editing. So if there's anybody out there that has access to some funds that could turn this into the series of, what she would like to do. I talked to her last fall, and what she'd like to do is put together a half-dozen hour-long documentaries, kind of styled on the public television style documentaries, and go into depth about not only what went on at the Agrarian Elders, but actually come out and do some footage on the farms of the elders that were represented. But as you might imagine, it's going to take some money to do that, and they've collected some, but they need to bring in much more. So if anyone has knowledge of people that might be able to help with funding on that, they can get in touch with me, and I'll get in touch with the organizers and with Deborah Coons Garcia. So thank you. So that was back in January. I've got one more slide. This will show you. Okay, that's a view. Now there's a little story to that. That is the Central Coast. The Esalen Center is approximately 1 mile from the picture you're looking at. Like that's looking south, ocean to the west. So you're looking south, and less than a mile away, a little bit of an inlet is a flat spot where this Esalen Institute is. And if you got our Seed Peas newsletter last week, I posted a photograph of that, which contains almost the entire Esalen Institute. From the Murphy house that we stayed in was just out of sight on the left, and the hot water baths were at the extreme right, but that contains most of it. So this is about something less than a mile away from Esalen Institute. What is significant is this is a turnout in the road, and this is the only place that you can get cell phone coverage in this part of the Central Coast. You cannot get cell phone coverage from Esalen Institute itself. In fact, they've got a payphone at the Murphy house, and some of the farmers calling into their crews were using the cell phone. But I haven't seen a cell phone for since we were at Esalen last time around. You don't see them that often. And I always figured that they must have done that by design. Esalen has been around 50 or 60 years now, and I figured if they wanted to get a cell tower, they could get one, but I believed that they did not have a tower there because they wanted people to engage, and ours was just one of several sessions that were going on, and I really, you could look up on the Esalen Institute website the vast array of topics that they have, healing topics, yoga topics, topics that I don't really have any background or knowledge in. It's a bit of a West Coast phenomenon. But what I learned this time around is there's a common eating area where you come up with your trays and you get served up the food, the good whole food that they're preparing there. And I didn't realize this, but they actually shut off the internet, the Wi-Fi at Esalen during meal times, so that if someone had a proclivity towards wanting to use their computer, you were out of luck when it was during mealtime, which I think is actually a good idea. I think we've become slaves to our electronic equipment, and Esalen Institute, that just confirms my suspicion that they could have got cell phone coverage there if they wanted it, but the fact is this is a retreat, and they think that people are going to do better without cell phones, and I'd agree with that. So the Agrarian Elders Gathering went on for 1 week, and it got done mid-afternoon on a Friday. And the next week was going to be the Organic Seed Growers Conference up in Corvallis, Oregon, about 4 days later. So it made no sense to fly back to the East Coast and then fly out to the West Coast again. So I decided that what I would do was rent a car and drive up the coast up to my meeting in Oregon, and I had 4 days to do it. So I did just that. Rented a car at the airport in Monterey and started to head up the coast. 4 days later, I'd driven 900 miles following Route 1 for its entirety in California from Big Sur up, and then went inland to 101 up through Eureka and up through Arcata and the Redwood Country up to Crescent City, and then following along the coast in Oregon up to Florence, Oregon, where I went inland and went into Eugene, Oregon, where I returned the car. So if I would highly recommend that if anybody has 4 days and you need to get to Oregon from California, I would definitely retrace my steps. It was a great trip, and I've got a few slides here that I'm going to share with you and a couple of stories involved. So the week before we were at Big Sur, California, many parts of California, most parts of California had received 5 inches of rain, and the streams were all very high. This is a picture taken at Muir Woods National Monument, and those are redwood trees that you see by the banks of the stream, and that is normally a pretty gentle stream, but and this really, the water dropped. So this was a week after all of that rain, so it was vigorous. There was a stream right next to our house at Big Sur that had a great waterfall, and the first day we were there, it was quite a torrent. It was really something to see, but 5 inches of rain will do that. So if you've never had a chance to get to Muir Woods National Monument, it's in Marin County. It's really not that many miles, must be only 10 or 15 miles away from the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And because of its proximity, it does get quite a bit of traffic, and it was almost impossible to find a parking space, and I was just about to give up, but found a spot, was able to get in, pay my $10 admission fee, and walk up the Valley Trail to the end, and then turn around and come back. And it's a beautiful monument of redwood trees with a beautiful stream going through the center of it. And what I wanted to do, they closed this thing down kind of early in the winter, 5 o'clock. I guess they don't want people to get lost in the woods. And so I got done about 4:30, and I wanted to go into the visitor center because I had read that they had an audio recording of a redwood tree falling over in the forest. And that is something that I really would like to hear. Well, wasn't I disappointed to learn that at 4:30, on a half hour before the park closes, they actually close the visitor center. So I didn't get to hear that audio. That is significant enough to me that I'm going to have to head back sometime to do that, because I would love to hear the sound of a redwood tree falling over. And there's a connection to this that you're going to see in a few more slides. But if you are in San Francisco and you have access to a car to get yourself up to Muir Woods, it really is worthwhile. I would think earlier in the day would probably be quieter. This is one of the realities of California, is that when I went to forestry school in Humboldt County at Humboldt State a year ago, when I started out going to forestry school 40 years ago at Humboldt State, the population of California was 19 million people, and the population of California today is 38 million people. And after having been away for most of 40 years, it's very apparent that you got twice as many people in California. It's much more crowded. There's much more built up. That was kind of the theme of this drive, like driving through Half Moon Bay, which is you know, maybe an hour south of San Francisco, between San Francisco and Santa Cruz. You know, back in the early 70s, that was just a sleepy little town, and now one would not recognize it, how much homes have built up. I imagine there are people that live down there and commute into San Francisco. It would be a great place to live, but compared to what it was 40, 45 years ago, it really is quite a change. Okay, so that was Muir Woods. Now this is on the map it says Rockport. We've got a Rockport, Maine, so the name stuck. Well, it's not like there's there's no buildings to be seen, but here is what's significant. If you have a map of Route 1 in California, it hugs the coast, and it goes up to southern Humboldt County, up to this very point. And what you're seeing straight ahead, that's called the Lost Coast of California. And when they constructed Route 1 back beginning in the 1920s, you can see how difficult a job it was going to be. The cliffs go directly into the ocean. They made their way up this far, and they looked ahead at the Lost Coast, and they gave up. They decided it was going to be too much headache to build Route 1 as a coastal highway. So this is the northern end of where Route 1 follows the coast. From here, it goes eastward and goes over the Coast Range and goes into Gurneyville in southern Humboldt County. So the interesting thing is that this area has never really been developed. There's some seasonal roads in there. There is a sparse population, but there is no highway. So there's towns like Petrolia. Well, back in the early 1970s, I took a hike down this, I think it's about 30 miles, plus or minus, maybe it's 40 miles, I've forgotten, of coastline that you can hike down the beach. I went from north to south along this north coast, and it really is phenomenal. In fact, as I recall, you've got to take tide tables with you, because there are some points to where you have to get around a point at low tide, because at high tide there's no beach to walk on, so you kind of have to plan accordingly. And one thing I remember is that it was so gray there. It was in the spring, but it was so gray, the clouds were so thick that you couldn't see the sun at all. You couldn't tell whether it was noontime or first thing in the morning, or if it was an hour before dark. The grayness, it just did not change at any hour of the day. And that's something different here in a state like Maine, where we don't get that fog. As the day goes along, you've got different types of light, and I know the photographers like to use the evening sun or the morning sun to take their photographs. Well, that was something that here on this north coast, or the Lost Coast of California, there just wasn't any way to tell what time of day it was. So from this point onward, you go inland, and one of the great things is that when you go inland, you come to southern Humboldt County, and the Eel River. And here's a painting that was in one of the visitor centers in one of the state parks, but it's redwood country, and it is really a wonderful place to be most times, but it's very flat, and they can get a whole lot of rain, and I'll be getting into that pretty quick. But the Eel River is the primary watershed in southern Humboldt County, and this was one artist's depiction of that beautiful area. So it's also redwood country historically, and this is a photograph of a logging truck taken in 1952, and by my read on that, those logs are each 40 feet long. They look to be 6 to 8 feet in diameter. I can't imagine how much of a load that is on that truck, but that's some kind of load. Again, that's 1952, so we're talking over 60 years ago. Back when I was going to forestry school, it was not uncommon to see 3 logs on a truck, but you'd have 2 cradle logs in the bottom outside corners that were maybe 2 foot in diameter, and they would cradle a single log that would be up to 8 feet in diameter, 40 feet long. You would see that every day of the week going up and down Highway 101. And I maybe saw 1 logging truck with some kind of moderate sized trees on, maybe 3 foot, 4 foot in diameter, but I think the days of these big diameter trees are long gone. And I know back 40, 45 years ago, 75–80% of the economy in Humboldt County was based on logging, and when it takes 1,000 years for trees to grow, it's pretty hard to do a good job of sustainable forestry. And from what I understand, the economy has been depleted because of the cut of trees that went at a faster rate than what nature would allow them to grow. Voice, not trees. Okay, Arthur says that I'm cutting out. If anyone else is having that problem, give us a little post on the chat. And I'll keep going. Hopefully it's just something aberrational. So in the southern part of Humboldt County, there's a 30 or 40 mile stretch of highway called Avenue of the Giants, and this is an alternative to Highway 101. And if you're up that way, I would definitely take the time to go. It weaves in and out of redwood trees and redwood groves. It's really beautiful. So this is typical of it. That's a redwood tree, which I want to tell you a little bit about. This tree fell over, as you can see, but it fell over, I would guess it probably fell over a week before, not very long before at all. And I'll show you. You can see that stream probably had a little bit of a limiting and erosive effect on the roots. Redwood trees are not very deep rooted, but the roots can go out laterally. Like if you've got a tree that's 300 foot tall, I think the roots can go out at least 150 or 200 feet. So they're well anchored, especially in a forest of redwood trees. Every tree supports one another. So in this one, you can see there's a little bit of decay in the tree, but when they got a wind, so this would be heading north, so they got a wind from the west, no doubt a storm wind, and for all I know, it was part of that storm that dropped the 5 inches of rain. You take a 300 foot tall tree with a strong wind and a little bit of rot at the base, and push is going to come to shove. Now, for perspective, the diameter of that tree is somewhere between 8 and 10 feet. It's a big tree. Well, I'll show you the next slide. That section where it went across the road is probably something like 130, 150 feet from the base of that tree, and at that point it's still about 6 foot in diameter. Many of the trees that are this size are about 1,000 years old. Somebody could stop and count the rings and find that out. But the interesting thing is this tree went right across the avenue of the highways, or the avenue of the giant highway. So here is a picture of that same tree from across the road looking back at it, and you can see the smaller tree on the left was a casualty of when a big redwood tree is coming down. Any tree that gets knocked by its branches is going to come down too. But the reason I took this picture is to see what happens when a redwood tree falls across an asphalt highway. And they got some hot patch or cold patch and patched in the road so that you could get across it. I'd like to have seen that after that redwood tree came down. And this circles back to that audio recording at Muir Woods National Monument. I would like to have heard the sound of that. I know the old-time loggers in the 1800s might spend a week getting the land ready for falling a big tree. They'd make a bed of boughs to try to cushion that fall so that it did not ruin the tree as it went down. If it hit too hard, it might kind of burst the tree so that it would kind of come apart and be hurt for lumbering purposes. So they would pad that to make it a more gentle fall. But obviously that must have been some kind of a traffic holdup the day that it came down. But as I looked at that cut with the chainsaw, it was a very fresh cut. I'm quite sure that it was done this winter, and it might have been done in that previous storm. Now, that Eel River has a historical tendency of flood, and talk about flooding, it is really pretty substantial. 1955 had a flood that within memory was the worst ever. A lot of houses were ruined. Well, then 9 years later, the flood right before Christmas of December 1964 was some that made the front pages and national headlines. It was a massive event, and it was around the 20th, 22nd of December, and they had a foot or two of snow in the mountains, and then a weather system came in that dropped 27 inches of rain in about 3 days, which melted the snow, and all of the streams turned into raging torrents. So if you look in this photograph, this is a sign I remember from 40, 45 years ago. Back then it was simply a white sign with black lettering on it. But the diagonal marks there, that's the high water mark of the 64 flood. And this is a very flat area. It is hard to comprehend how much water was involved. But if you look at this photograph, follow that road up, there's a bridge up ahead. And that bridge, you know, there was a fair amount of muddy water in the Eel as I went by, you know, from the rain and the muddy streams that filled it. But that was a good 20, 25 feet below that bridge, flowing, wintertime flows. So then that sign is probably 15 feet up in the air above the level of the bridge. So that water came up, you know, 40, 45, 50 feet, something like that. And it isn't like it's a narrow canyon. This is a very big flat area. So the amount of water with that kind of rain was really something. And that 1964 flood is in everybody's memory. And in fact, I went into the visitor center at the state park there and talked to a couple of the older women that were working behind the counter as volunteers, and we chatted about that, and they were there at that time, and it wiped out a lot of towns. They decided after 2,000-year floods within 9 years to not rebuild some of that. In some of the houses that did not get unlodged and washed down the river, there was 3 foot of silt left in those houses after the waters went down. But here's another picture that gives an indication. Many of the bridges in this area were completely wiped out. Along the different river drainages where this heavy rain came, you had 300 sawmills back in 1964. So all of these sawmills had yards full of redwood logs and Douglas fir logs. And when the floodwaters came, they took all those logs and put them into the river. And as those logs went down the flooding river, they were like battering rams on these bridges. So this is, you can imagine, this is one well-constructed bridge, and it survived, but many, many bridges went out, and southern Humboldt County up to Del Norte County on the Oregon border were completely isolated. They had no way to get supplies in, so they brought in an aircraft carrier to fly in supplies. They turned some of Highway 101 into an airstrip to try to get in food and supplies for the people that survived. But the thing I want to point out about this bridge is if you look up about halfway on the photograph, it looks like kind of muddy there. Well, that is actually a log which has been embedded in the girder of the bridge, but that is an indication of how high the flood waters were that log got lodged in there. So that must be a good 10 maybe 12 foot high above the surface level of the bridge, and it's really quite a miracle that that bridge is still standing, that it didn't get washed out. Okay, so I told you, I promised that I would bring you back to potatoes. So here is my final slide of the Eel River area, and this is a crop of potatoes. The settlers, the white settlers, came into this area in around the 1870s after the Civil War. It is starting out, it was very diversified. They ended up growing a lot of apples. In this case, they were growing potatoes. In more recent generations, it shifted largely to dairy farms. There's a lot of extensive grazing that goes on. There's a lot of organic dairy farms up there now, but it's still an area rich in agricultural production. But back in its day, as in all agriculture, it was very diversified. But I thought this would be a good jumping off point for talking about planting. The thing that occurs to me first off is how wide those rows are apart. I would estimate, given the height of those guys, are probably 5'6" Those rows look to me to be about 4 foot apart. He's got a walk-behind hoe that is using to hill up the dirt around those potatoes, which was, used here in Maine as well up through. I'm not sure when they switched over to a riding implement, still a one-row implement that would have covering discs in back. But, it was probably pre-World War II, so this was commonly done. In fact, back 35 years ago, that's how we used to hoe potatoes, was we had a workhorse, and she'd pull a walk behind, and I'll tell you, that would tire you out. After a couple of acres of potatoes, you would have walked about 5 or 6 miles, and working that whole time as you push that hiller into the soil to be able to force dirt up. It was not a walk in the park. It was hard work. But their planting at 4 foot spacing is, I would guess, was probably common to the time. Now what is common is spacing based on 3 foot, and in Aroostook County that's the norm. When you've got 4 foot spacing compared to 3 foot spacing, by dropping to 3 foot, you're probably going to get 33% more of the yield. As you can see, those plants are, a week or 10 days before what we would call road closure here. I don't think those rows are ever going to close. Now, the benefit of planting that wide is you're going to get a drying out of the foliage, which will make it more resistant towards, fungal invasion like potato late blight. But nowadays, most everyone is going to plant closer together to try to get complete coverage. It's all this effort of trying to get the highest yield to make, from an economical standpoint, making the acre pay the most in terms of return on the dollar invested. So back then, 4 foot rows, nowadays 3 foot rows, but those look like plants. I would think that it can get very hot in the summertime in the Eel River, like with into the 90s every day, into the low 100s. I would guess this is probably taken in the spring. Maybe the crop is about ready to harvest in another 3 or 4 weeks, so this might be late May or something like that, and the crop would come out sometime in June. So one of the things I want to point out is that planting is not the first thing you do in the spring. It's one of the last things you do in the spring. A lot of what you're doing is getting the ground ready.
So in some areas, that simply is a matter of harrowing to fluff the ground up and to incorporate any residue from the previous year. In a place like Aroostook County where you've got a lot of rocks, one of the things that we prefer to do, and 3 out of 4 years the conditions allow us to do this, is ahead of the planter we go through with a rock picker, a mechanical rock picker, and remove the rocks. We've had a lot of glaciers come through, and we have good potato ground up here, but we've got a lot of rocks. So removing the rocks is good because the rocks will bruise and damage potatoes, and we've removed hundreds of tons of rocks, both by hand and mechanically, and that's one of the first steps that we do in getting a field ready for planting. Another thing that we do is we take soil tests every 4 years. We have a 4-year rotation. In the fall, before we plant potatoes, we take a soil sample and we send it down to Lancaster Ag Products in Pennsylvania, who jobs it out. And I think they have Midwest Ag Services do their soil samples for them. But for $50, you get a lot of information back. Typically on our 10-acre field, we'll take 4 soil tests from 4 different quadrants so that we can gain some understanding. We know, for example, that the back part of our fields away from the roads are not quite as fertile as the front part, so we usually give that a little bit more fertilizer to bring up the mineral content. But this is a fairly typical recipe of what we put on. We apply a ton to the acre, and these are formulas that it would be depicted, you know, based on what is in that soil. So typically in our area, we tend to be deficient in zinc and boron. Boron is quite water soluble, so that in the east it's pretty easy to be deficient. It's kind of water soluble like nitrogen. So we verify this situation not only with soil tests, but we also do foliar test, a tissue test of the potato plant itself. But so you see rock phosphate, dolomitic limestone or calcitic limestone, gypsum, a source of calcium, humates, zinc sulfate as that supply of zinc, manganese sulfate, again, manganese is an important micronutrient, magnesium sulfate, another source, magnesium for fertility, and then calcium borate, which is the form of similar to solubor. It's a form of boron, a mined product. So what these things all have in common is that they are rock powders that are ground up, so they are slow release, and once every 4 years we, prior to putting on potatoes, we apply this with a drop lime spreader. We've actually got 2 lime spreaders. We have 2 men, 2 tractors, 2 lime spreaders, and that they help each other load each other's lime spreader. Then they go spread a round trip and then load again. So in that way we can complete fertilizing a field within 1 day with 2 men. And as the slide depicts, we back then were using layer hen manure, which was a follow-up after the herring scale became unavailable when that fisheries collapsed. And then in the year of planting, we use dry fish meal fertilizer or something of that sort that puts on about 70 pounds of nitrogen. 7-11-1 means 7% nitrogen, 11% phosphorus, and 1% potassium. So at 1,000 pounds, 7% would be 70 pounds of nitrogen, 110 pounds of phosphoric acid, PTO5, and 10 pounds of KTO, K2O, or potassium. So that's how it's measured. But that gives us good, vigorous plants. Potatoes are heavy feeders. You want to make sure that you give adequate fertility. And if you ever doubt whether your garden is sufficient to go without added fertilizer, I suggest you do this test. Have a couple of equal rows, same variety, plant them on the same day, and get some good organic fertilizer for vegetables. We have a couple of different ones, potato fertilizer that we sell, and all-purpose, and lay that in furrow 2 inches below where the seed piece is laid so the roots can grow into it. So on one row, fertilize it, then plant. On the other row, avoid fertilizing, and then just observe through the summer whether you're getting any benefit. And if you're getting benefit, you'll prove to yourself that the fertilizer was valuable and worth the money. And if you don't see any difference, then that's an expense that you can avoid. But in our experience, it's a rare garden that has all of the fertility that potatoes need, and usually supplemental fertility is going to pay yourself big dividends in the harvest, and you could easily get twice as much of a harvest by having adequate fertility in there. So this is our potato planter. It's a special potato planter. It's called a tuber unit planter, and there's only a few of them that are being used in the state of Maine at this point. But it's particularly valuable for planting potatoes grown for seed under organic conditions. As you can see, there are 4 workers on back, and our planter is a 2-row planter. So what the workers are doing, they are taking, well, let me go to the next slide. They are taking green sprouted seed, which is in that hopper. There are mounted seed knives there, and they are taking the mother tuber and cutting that up into the appropriate size, which we recommend that the seed piece size should be 1.5 ounces per seed piece. And the way you can visualize that, if you picture a seed potato the size and shape of a large hen's egg, that would be about 2.5 ounces. So a tuber that size you would cut in half. If it was any smaller, you would leave it whole. And if it was larger, you would cut it into cubic sized shaped pieces, cube-shaped pieces, that are approximately the size of half of a large hen's egg. And you can see on the conveyor belt there the appropriate size. What you want to avoid are what are called, in the potato trade, pickle slicers, where they look like dill spears. That's a relatively inefficient way for the seed piece to get nutrition from the seed piece out to the eyes. The most efficient way for that is going to be a square, blocky type. So that's how you want to cut your seed. When you cut your seed to 1.5 ounces per seed piece on average, that gives you approximately 10 seed pieces per pound. And the way that you calculate out your need on an acre basis, and you'll have to forgive me, I think on acre basis is, I have friends out in Montana that don't talk of acres, they talk of sections and quarter sections, a section being 640 acres, a quarter section 160 acres. Here in Maine, we talk about acres, that's how I think of acres. If you've got a smaller garden, there's going to be a conversion, but the same idea can be figured from the numbers that I'm going to be going over here. But if you take, in 1 acre, there's 43,560 square feet. And if you have rows that are planted 3 foot apart, you divide 3 into 43,560, and you come up with 14,520. And what that number is the number of row feet per acre at 3 foot spacing. So if you figure out at 10 seed pieces per pound, and you want to get, say if you're shooting for, just keep the math simple here, your seed spacing in row to be 1 foot apart, you would need 14,520 seed pieces per acre. And if you've got 10 seed pieces per pound, that means you're going to need 1,452 pounds of seed potatoes to be able to plant that. And in fact, it takes something like 1,400, 1,500, up to 2,000 pounds to plant most varieties. Now, most varieties people are going to plant a little bit shy of 12 inches. If they're russets, you plant longer. The reason is this. Here's the rule of thumb. The spacing in row is based on your expected set. So a high set, a set is the number of tubers per hill. A high set, like a russet variety or a fingerling variety, you would plant that at maybe 16 to 18 inch apart so that each of the tubers has adequate space in which to grow and size up. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a variety like Yukon Gold or a variety like Reddale that is fairly frugal with how many tubers it's going to set. Excuse me. So to compensate for that, there's a couple of things you can do. One, you want to increase your spacing in row. So most people growing table stock Yukon Gold, they're going to want to plant those about 8 or 9 inches apart in row. Since you're down at that point, you're talking, you're going to need a third to a quarter, again, as many seed pieces per acre. So you're going to go up from 1,500 pounds up to 2,000, 2,200 pounds. In our case, since we're raising seed potatoes, we want we don't want to suffer a yield loss, but we want the size profile of the tubers that we're harvesting to run moderate and small. So in our case, we space 6.7 inch in row for most of our varieties, not the russets, not the fingerlings, but for most we do. And that requires about 3,000 pounds of seed per acre. So getting back to tuber unit planting, the mother tuber that you're pulling out of the hopper that has been green sprouted, you cut that into the appropriate number of pieces, 2 pieces, 3 pieces, sometimes 4 pieces. And then on a tuber unit planter, you lay those 2, 3, or 4 seed pieces sequentially on that segmented conveyor belt. As that conveyor belt moves forward, it then lays the cut seed pieces sequentially in the row, and it plants them as what is called a tuber unit. And the value of this is an old-time technique that the old-timers did and that we continue, though we have it in a mechanized format. This is a tremendous advantage to us in roguing out tubers that express potato virus. So in the summertime, from the point the plants are about 10 inches of height, they start to have enough maturity to start to express contamination by virus, and we physically remove them from the field, and either we bury them. What we've taken doing in recent years is we put them on the edge of the woods, and we put a piece of clear plastic over the top and let the sun kind of putrefy and bake them, and they melt down, and then we put rocks around the perimeter so that aphids can't get in there and feed on that and go into the healthy potatoes and spread virus. But bottom line is, though, you remove the plants out of the field, and that prevents it. You're removing the inoculum so that aphids, which are the vector of virus, are not able to spread the virus to healthy plants. So by planting in the tuber unit, every seed piece from the mother tuber is going to express that virus. Now, some varieties express it more visually than others. Some are very difficult to detect. Russet Norcota is an example of a virus that is, or a variety that's very hard to rogue out. It's just something like a symptomless carrier of potato virus. So that's one reason we don't grow Russet Norcota. The other reason is it's got a pretty poor taste and it doesn't deserve to be grown. But what we don't want is something that is going to give us virus to our other varieties and something that we're not able to rogue out. So when you have planted by the tuber unit, typically you're going to find maybe 1 or 2 of the plants are a little bit stunted, and then you're going to dig them up, and you can what we call it is jigsaw puzzle the seed piece back together. You can figure out by how the seed piece was cut how many pieces there are in the unit, and then you keep pulling up plants and jigsaw puzzle back their seed pieces until you get what is a complete unit. Occasionally you go down the row in the wrong direction and you pull out a healthy plant, but that's just part of the collateral damage. But what we're very anxious to do is to pull out every member of that tuber unit, because even if one expresses the virus early on, the others are going to express it later, and they're going to be hot and carrying that virus, so we're going to pull it out. So tuber unit planting allows us to do a much better job at roguing, and that's one of the things that we're doing in a normal year 4 to 5 times. We'll go through the field 4 to 5 times, pulling out hot spots and trying to remove the inoculum, so if we should get aphids, we're not going to have the aphid spread of virus. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Oh, next slide. How about that? I guess I should have been using that that guide. Okay, the next slide is simply our contact information, and lo and behold, it is 2 o'clock. So I'm going to catch up reading some of the comments here. Oh, we've got a couple of folks that have to be leaving, and they realize, because they've been on here before, that we are going to post this. Given our slow internet, it may not go up until tomorrow, but we will post this online. And for those of you that have been on this call, we'll send you an email with the link to that. So it's a way, if you want to watch it again, to get a second view on things, or if you want to share it with friends, you'll be able to do that. So I thank you for joining us today. Oh, let's see. I had a calendar somewhere. What I want to do before I let you go is tell you when the next webinar is going to be. I've got to find my calendar here. Well, Frank, around the corner, it's 3 weeks from today. I think is it March 5 or 3 weeks? Frank is looking up on a calendar here. I'll give you the date in 1 second. Okay, March 3rd. March 3rd. Okay, it's also going to be on a Thursday. It's going to be 3 weeks from today. It'll be March 3rd, same time, same place, so I hope you can join us then. And if anyone has any questions, I'll hang around for a few more minutes. Feel free to type in your questions, and if not, we'll say goodbye, and we hope to see you again in 3 weeks from today. Oops, right? They're saying that's only 2 weeks. Count your weeks again. Just 1 second.
Next week is the 20th. Oh, no, you're right. It's going to be the 10th.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that, Scott.
Put the last line of
Yeah, okay. These calendars are hard. Okay, so it's going to be the 10th?
10th.
Okay, we're talking March 10th, 3 weeks from today, March 10th. It's also a Thursday. It's also 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Pacific time. So thank you for that, Scott. So if there's any questions, we're happy to stay and answer them. If not, we'll see you again, I hope, in 3 weeks. As we're waiting here, I'll tell one little story of when I was in Humboldt County. I lived, when I was going to college, I lived in a little town called Fieldbrook, and it was outside of Arcata, about 6 miles. I used to ride my bicycle into school and into work when I worked on a farm out there. And all of my neighbors worked at the Bonnie Stud Mill, which would be a 24-hour-a-day mill, and you'd hear the saws whine day. And they would take these large redwood logs and turn them into studs, 2x4 by 8s, which seemed at the time to be an incredible waste. But that's the way it was, and my neighbors all worked there. So I scouted out this place. I found, after 40 years, found the same road. we were college students, and on this little property there were some, trailers and mobile homes. That was back in the days of laissez-faire government, I think. And I more or less figured out about where the lot was, but those trailers 40 years later were long gone. But after I left that area, I knew Bonnie Stud Mill was not still around, so I drove about a mile to get over there. Maybe it was half a mile. And lo and behold, there is no Bonnie Stud Mill anymore, but what that, a mill is going to have a lot of buildings, and that there's a new business there, and it's an organic potting soil company has set up shop there, and they're using all those good buildings. So I imagine that they're composting, sawdust and waste. There's dairy farms, so they're probably composting dairy manure. But it was interesting to see that the Bonnie Stud Mill has a new life as an organic business. And right next to that is the E&O bowling alley, which was a combination bowling alley and bar, and that's still going strong. So 40 years later, that business, and there was a little, what had been a little country store, which had a sign up saying that since 1971, so when I was out there, it was about 74, 75, so I guess it was only a few years old at that point, and that's still, it's larger now, but that's still going strong. So that really is business that is left. What's interesting to me is to see that, it's not only rural Maine that has taken it hard on the chin. The, rural America, I can see, you go into Arcata and there's a lot of business, a lot of activity, but you get 5 or 6 miles outside of town, and those rural areas have been depopulated. There's a lot fewer people. There's a lot fewer houses there than when we were there. There were, it was pretty crowded, really, for being in the country. But times change, and rural America is still struggling. But it was interesting after 40 years. This is the first time I'd been back in 40 years to see what kind of change had gone on, and to see that, the struggles that we have here in rural Maine with a weak economy that's based on woods work and farming, that goes on in Northern California as well. Here Scott is saying that 3 decades ago that he lived in Limestone, Maine, which is north of us by about an hour. People now as there were then. That's true, Scott. I would guess maybe you were connected to Loring Air Force Base, which closed down in 1994, 22 years ago, but there were 10,000, yeah, I guess that one right. There were 10,000 civilian personnel, as I recall, 10,000. So that was a big part of the economy up here, good paying jobs. There were a lot of people that their experience of Maine is living in Limestone or Caribou and working at Loring Air Force Base that was started up in the early 1950s. But yeah, we have had a decline in population. At one point, Aroostook County had, I think, at peak 106,000 population, and we're now down to 70,000. Almost every decade, the census indicates that we've lost a few more, but I think we've stabilized out. I know our town of Bridgewater, at peak, right before World War I, we had 1,200 people, and we have now bottomed out at 600, and for the last 20 or 30 years, it's been around 600 to 650, so we've not dropped below 600. We seem to have bottomed out, but, many decade after decade of low potato prices and low pulpwood prices do take their toll on the economy, and it's not just the case here in Maine, but as I can see, it's in Humboldt County and Del Norte County, California, places that were very much based on lumber in the past, and the economy has changed, and rural areas have a tendency to take it on the chin. So. Okay, well, I guess we'll call that commentary. So I guess we'll sign off now. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we hope that you'll be able to meet us 3 weeks from now on March 10th for webinar number 5. So long.
Yeah, right.